Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you'll take your seats, we're about to begin. Thank you for coming today to our long-awaited lecture from the Society of the Friends of the AUB Museum. I'd like to welcome you to DNA and the Origin of Peoples, the Armenians, a conference by Peter Hrechdakian. He gave me an English pronunciation, not French nor Armenian, so take it up with him. As co-administrator of the Armenian DNA project, we'd like to welcome him. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Peter, just in case you don't know. Peter founded the Armenian DNA project in 2008 with Mark Aslan and Hovan Simonian. Born in Aleppo in 1958, he grew up in Lebanon before emigrating to the USA in 1975 and on to Belgium in 1991 before returning to Lebanon in 2017. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Philosophy from Cornell University, which is in Ithaca, New York, in case you don't know, and a Master's in Business Administration degree from Harvard Business School, which is in Boston, in case you didn't know. He is the CEO of the Unifert Group, a privately held international fertilizer trading and agricultural inputs distribution company established in 1968. A self-taught geneticist, he wants to combine information from genetics, history, anthropology, linguistics, archaeology, to uncover the deep ancestry of the populations of Western Asia from which the Armenian people arose. He also wants to understand how the diverse Armenian genetic pool was affected by broad historical processes such as invasions, migrations, wars, forced population transfers, natural catastrophes, etc., and also subtle processes such as admixture, conversion, and micromigration. The co-author of a number of academic papers, he lectured frequently on the subject of the genetic history of the Armenians, most notably at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., in case you didn't know. Very important. In 2015, on the centenary of the Armenian genocide, he funded ancient DNA research in Armenia, as well as paleontological digs in Karabakh?
Yeah, Karabakh.
Karabakh, yes. So please welcome Peter with me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay, good, excellent. Thank you. So as you've heard, I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a scientist. I would have loved to be a historian, an archaeologist like Nadine, or a geneticist, but I'm none of these. I'm just a businessman with a passion for history and archaeology. These things were really imbued in me by my father, who was passionate about this. So when I was young, we would go to all sorts of archaeological sites in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, and we would always be talking about history, and I always have history books by my bedside. So this is something I've always been interested in. And one thing which I found interesting when the science of genetics came out as applied to individuals like us, I found it intriguing that by taking a genetic test, you can find out about your ancient roots. So in 2008, I decided, in 2005, actually, I started thinking about these things. I wasn't sure about the science, but finally I decided in 2007 to get tested. And I was living in Brussels at the time, and I chose Family Tree DNA as the company to be tested initially. Afterwards, I tested with all the companies to see if they were saying the same thing. And I get a certificate from them. I was living in Belgium, telling me, congratulations, your paternal line is Jewish and your maternal line is Russian, which I don't have a problem with that, but it felt very strange to me that I would have this kind of ancestry since I'm 3/4 Armenian and 1/4 German. So I started digging, and when I dig, and I saw that they were simplifying things because that science was very new at the time, and it was very, very simple what they were saying, and they made assumptions about what my origins were because of the fact I was living in Brussels. If I was living in Beirut, they would have said something else. So by digging, I understood how it was working, and it was very rudimentary at the time. And I got in touch with a small group of people who were already looking into the same thing, mainly for genealogical purposes. And I got in touch with them, and that's how we founded the Armenian DNA Project together in 2008. So this is a little bit the history of it. And I started lecturing, by the way, in Lebanon on the subject. I did a test run in Anjar, which is this Armenian town in the Bekaa. The Hamaskayin invited me, so I sat up there and started talking in English, and they raised their hands and they said, in Armenian, please. And I don't speak very good Armenian, so it had to be simultaneously translated. But it was a trial run 3 days before my first official lecture at Hrechdakian University. I was invited there by Hrechdakian, who's in the audience. And it was, voila, right here. It was interesting at the time, and it was 14 years ago, 13 years ago now. Things have changed a lot since then. As was mentioned, I gave a very important lecture at the Library of Congress. I was invited there by Levon Avdoyan, who's the head of the Armenology and Armenian and Georgian wing of the Library of Congress. And at the time, I basically explained everything that we knew. The lecture was taped, as is this one. It will be available afterwards in the internet. And it's available both on YouTube and on the website of the Library of Congress. And to date, it has been watched, I think, 400,000 times. So it's a subject that interests a lot of people. But this lecture builds a little bit on what I said at the time, and it adds many things that we've discovered since. And the discoveries have been very, very important, and as you will see. So it's a lot of slides. It's a very visual subject, so I'm going to be going through slides that I borrow from a variety of papers that have come throughout the years. I will reference some of the papers also, so you can see that. Since it's taped, you can always watch it again afterwards to better understand. And at the end, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Okay, so first of all, we'll start with the history and geography of the Armenians, for those of you who would not know, looking at where the pointer is, right here. So current Armenia is here in yellow, and we've just lost Karabakh, which was an autonomous province within Azerbaijan a month ago, very sadly. Historical Armenia is this dotted line. This is where historically the Armenians lived. You had Greater Armenia and Smaller Armenia. In red was the Armenian Republic between 1918 and 1920. In green was the Armenian state that was supposed to be born out of the defeat of the Ottomans after World War I, but it never came to be. This is the greatest extent of the Armenian kingdom at the time of Tigran the Great, which is in 70 before Christ, basically. It included all of Lebanon and Syria, but obviously there weren't Armenians there. It's just territories that were conquered. And this last part, Cilicia, is where many of the Armenians who were living in that area fled when the Seljuk Turks arrived in about 1050 or something like that. And they actually moved there, and they founded this Armenian region called Cilicia. And you still have a lot of Armenians. Most of us Armenians from Lebanon and Syria come from this region. But this kingdom was defeated by the Mamluks and vanished in 1300 or something. I have all the dates afterwards. So Geographically, this is very important. You're talking about this area, basically. As you can see, it's extremely mountainous. This is Lebanon, and you can see the mountains of Lebanon here. So this is really, really high mountains. This is the Armenian plateau, very inhospitable, very high peaks, very cold in the winter. So many people went through, but few people stayed. And for us, Armenians, it was a refuge. And the fact that it's mainly the geography that protected us. I think many populations who live in mountains, which are difficult to reach, tend to be able to preserve themselves much more than people who live on plains, where you don't have natural barriers to invasions. So the geography is very important to understand the Armenians. So within this area, you've had a number of important cultures. This is for those of you who are archaeologists. I'm just listing them: Neolithic, late Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, and late Bronze Age. These are all cultures that archaeologists study. By the way, I forgot to thank the AUB Museum for inviting me, sorry, and Nadine. It's so lovely, yeah. So if we can slice this part and put it at the beginning, I would appreciate it. It's just I'm a little bit nervous. So thank you so much. It's fitting that we're doing this at the AUB Archaeological Museum, because we're talking about archaeogenetics a little bit. Archaeology as applied to genetics. For me, who's a frustrated archaeologist because I never studied it. For me, DNA studies is like archaeology of the blood. I mean, by studying the blood, you can go back beyond history, beyond archaeology. You can go back to the dawn of time, basically. Because in us, in our genes, we have a record of all of our ancestors. And as you'll see, it's really, really fascinating. So, and you have also a lot of Neolithic sites that are more than 10,000 years old. The region in which we lived, and further south, we'll talk about the Southern Arc, which is also a little bit the Fertile Crescent, was the birthplace of many, many things, including metallurgy, domestication of animals, agriculture, cities, and from there they spread. Of course, there were other areas where these things developed independently, but these were some of the oldest, along with the Indus Valley, if I'm not mistaken. So to continue, you had a lot of people who lived in the area that I talked about before the Armenians did. You have them here. The Hattians, Hurrians, then Luvians, Assyrians, Hittites, Hayasa Azi, the Mitanni, Nairi, the Phrygians, and the Urartians. Here, as we get into the Phrygian and Urartian, we start getting into the historical records. Although all of these people left writings, at least starting from the Assyrians forward, because on the other people who lived before, we don't really have direct information or writing about them. We can just infer. But all of these people lived there, and Armenians are probably the descendants of some of these ancient inhabitants of the region. After it became Armenia, or the Armenians started establishing what I call the koine, it's like a state which speaks a language where people have a shared culture. You had a number of people who went through. You had the Cimmerians and the Scythians who came from the north and invaded. You had the Medes, the ancestors, and the Achaemenid Persians, the ancestors of the current Persians. You had the Greeks and the Romans, the Byzantines. The Arabs went through all the way up to Georgia and Azerbaijan in 330 AD. In 640 AD. Then the Turks came in 1550. Then the Mongols went through very quickly, and the Mamluks, of course, came during this period, and they defeated the Kingdom of Cilicia. So these are the people that went through, and we had contacts with a lot of different people who lived in the regions. They're all listed here. Some of them are very old names from the historical record. Some of them are more recent and still exist. The Laz, the Georgians, Fans, Cherkess, Mingrelians, all of these people are living populations. The others are now extinct. Not extinct, but they've evolved into something else. So the questions we're going to be asking here is, that's the main question that we're going to address, is what is the genetic origin of Armenians? Where do we come from? Have we been there forever? Are we people who came from a different area of the world? Are we a mix of migrants and natives? History says something, mythology also. Archaeology probably says something else. According to Herodotus, the Armenians were people, Indo-European speakers who were cousins of the Phrygians and who came into Armenia from the west, coming from the Balkans and going through Greece into Anatolia. This is what he wrote about, and for a long, long time people thought that this is where Armenians came from. Maybe not genetically, but linguistically, or part of the Armenians. So we didn't know, we really didn't know. So the questions we ask ourselves is, can we shed light on where we come from through genetics? And another question we have to ask ourselves is, are we similar to our neighbors or not? So we can, when we study our DNA, we can study the DNA of our neighbors also and do comparisons. And we can try to find out where our language came from. Now, it's a difficult task to know where your language comes from, because people change languages very easily. We know in the record that some people spoke. I'm not going to say something which is not correct, but people change languages. Some of us lose the language and adopt the language of the country where we are. You have a lot of Armenians who immigrated to all over the world. They lose their language. They start talking the language of the people they live with, and they get assimilated. The Armenians of Aintab, because on my maternal side we are from Aintab, they were known in the 1850s to speak only Turkish. They had lost the knowledge of Armenian. They still knew the Armenian alphabet, and I have a Bible from my grandmother, which is written in Armenian script, but it's Turkish behind. And from what I heard, it's only the arrival of the missionaries, the Protestant missionaries, who basically retaught to the Armenians of Aintab to use their language because they had lost it to some extent. And last but not least, can ancient DNA studies throw light on these questions? This is what I mentioned at the beginning. When I did the lecture at the Library of Congress, all we had was people like you and me who had been tested and who joined the Armenian DNA project, and we were looking at living people and trying to make inferences about the past. What has changed a lot since then is that we can extract the DNA from ancient skeletons going back thousands and tens of thousands of years, and we can compare it to the living DNA. And this gives you a three-dimensionality, and it's just absolutely fascinating what you can find out. So this is the project that I launched with some of my colleagues here, Hovan Simonian and Mark Arslan. We are also, we have three other people who are with us, Janek Ashukian, Liz Chatter, and Mher Ishkhanian. So three of us focus on deep ancestry, Hovan, Mher, and myself. And three focus on genealogy, because for many people, genetics is about finding cousins, being able to do the family tree, but it only goes back a few generations. But for Armenians, it's important because we don't have any written record, especially those of us who are from the Ottoman Empire. Everything was burned and destroyed. So it's very often, it's only through genetics that we can try to find connections with people. In any other place in the US and Europe, you can go back centuries and you have records. And you can spend all your time tracing back people for centuries. But Armenians do not. So a lot of people who get tested are interested in the genealogical aspect. But some of us are really interested in the deep ancestry. And Hovan is doing extraordinary work, also studying the ancient, the DNA of certain populations, and he's sequencing their Y chromosome. I'm going to explain this in a while. So I hope a book comes out of it, because it's going to be really, really fascinating what he's doing. He's doing like genealogy, but centuries back. Mainly about the Armenian royal and princely families also that go back to the 2,000 years almost. So the first paper that came out on the subject dates from 2001. And Levon Yepitzkoposyan, who is one of the key people still involved in this, wrote an article. It was a very rudimentary science at the time. And as I mentioned, it's only in 2005, 6, 7 that I got interested in this, and 2007 that I got tested, and 2008 we launched the project. And here I'm just repeating things I've already said. The project goes into deep ancestry. This is my interest. Or genealogy. And as I mentioned, there are many reasons why Armenians want to be tested. Because if you're an orphan, for example, or a descendant from an orphan, you'll be able to find out about your ancestry. And you have a lot of Armenians who were forcibly or who willingly converted to Islam to avoid the genocide. And only now they're rediscovering their past, and they can use this to find out who they were related to, and they can find out if they have Armenian origins or not. The academic researchers basically do population genetics and now ancient DNA. These are professionally trained historians, archaeologists, geneticists. They do very large-scale studies, and they publish academic papers. And we use a lot of this. This is the number of people in our project right now. We're up to 5,000 people. So Mark Arslan started the project before I joined for the Armenians from Keri, and then it grew, and it's diminishing here. These are the new joiners, but it's still something that is very, very interesting for a lot of people. And you have multiple companies that provide it. This is just family tree DNA. If you get tested at one of the other companies, you can always transfer your data to this one to compare with more people. How many of you have had DNA tests? I forgot to ask in here. Okay, it's less than a dozen also. Okay, good. Any of you geneticists who work in the field here? No. We don't have Pierre Zaloua or Mark Haber or any of the people who are doing this work here? No. Okay. Because in Lebanon, there's a lot of research on the subject. You might wonder where the people who join and get tested, individuals like you and me, are from. This is a map from where their ancestors come from, and you see that it covers pretty much the whole region in which Armenians lived. So everything is basically covered here. We're not just Western Armenians, you have Eastern Armenians, and you also have Armenians from Iran also, and from Azerbaijan and from Georgia. So it's really Jerusalem, so from everywhere. For those of you who know nothing about it, a very quick run through about what it's all about. We're all made up of chromosomes. We have 22 chromosomes, and there's 24 in total, and 2 of them decide what is our sex. So women have 2 X chromosomes, men have an X and a Y. This is basically what decides if you're a man or a woman. And part of the, and the mix of who you are, by the way, is a mix of all your parents. So when you're a child, you have the DNA of your mother and your father. Of course, they have the DNA of the grandmother and your grandmother and your grandfather. And it's the same thing on the other side. This is the paternal side. This is the maternal side. And you're a mix of all of this. You can go up 7 or 8 generations and still have bits and pieces of the DNA of your ancestors. But beyond, you lose it. And this is what I was explaining. Male to X's. X and Y, female to X's. And what's really interesting about this is how you can use genetics for deep ancestry, is that men inherit the Y chromosome from their father, and their father inherited it from his father, etc., etc. So when you study, when any of you get tested, men, women cannot do that. If they don't have a brother to be a proxy, and their father or an paternal uncle is not living, they won't be able to find out what their paternal Y chromosome line is, but men can do that. And it goes on to the dawn of time, basically, because you will see a tree of the Y DNA when you take the global population as a whole in view, and you're able to reconstitute when people when their ancestors lived and when the branches of the tree forked. But you'll see that more clearly later. For women and men, we inherit from our mother mitochondria. These are organisms that are in our cells that exist in symbiosis with all living organisms for millions of years, but they were initially separate organisms that entered the cell and are responsible for energy transfer and production. What's interesting about these is that they have their own DNA, and it comes from the mother to her children, boys and girls, and then only the girls can pass them on to their children. So by looking at this mitochondrial DNA, you can also go back the maternal line all the way to the dawn of time, okay? So you can go this way, you can go this way, but the rest of it is just a mix of DNA that you have. But it doesn't go as far, it only goes a few generations. And when you get your mitochondrial DNA fully sequenced, this is something important, is that now when you do a DNA test, you can do the most expensive tests, which cost a few $100s, and be it on the male side or on the female side, you can really sequence your entire DNA and then file it in a genetic bank on an anonymous basis. This is my filing here. It says that I'm a human and that I'm an Armenian ethnically, and I come from Gaziantep, which is the current name of Aintab. So if all of the people who get tested put their information anonymously in this genetic base, it's very useful for researchers, and you'll see later why. So this comes back to what I was saying before. This is the mitochondrial line. This is the Y-DNA line, and everything else is a mix of all of your ancestors. So when we compare people, we can compare on the two direct lines or on the tutti frutti, the mix of all of the DNA. And at family tree DNA, for example, in order to facilitate comparisons and facilitate to be able to tell you when you get tested which populations are close to you, they've split the world in a variety of populations. And for our region, for example, you're basically it's Anatolia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. Initially, when they were at the very beginning, when they were starting, they decided to define the DNA of this region as Armenian, and I told them it was a mistake because you had a lot of Turks who were doing the DNA test, and they were telling them they were Armenian, when they may have been, but they were not necessarily so. So they broadened it into Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. You have the Arabian Peninsula, you have a Bedouin group, you have some Jewish groups, Yemeni and Mizrahi, which are the local Jews. Then you have the southern Levant, and you have the northern Levant. Lebanon and Syria are part of the northern Levant. You also have the Caucasus, which is split in three, and the Druze are also an isolated population with a very peculiar DNA, which warrants having it as a separate category. So this is basically what they do. And then when you compare the DNA of the people in the region and you do statistical analysis called PCA analysis, you can see who's close to whom. And this, you'll see more of these later, but basically these are some of the early PCA analysis work that was done. And you can see that Armenians who are where here? The Armenians here are very close to the Turks genetically, and to Iranians, Georgian Jews, Assyrians. Georgians are a bit different, a bit of an isolate. Then you have Azeri Jews. The Lebanese are closer to Armenians than would be the Yemenis or Jordan, Syria. Voilà, this is Syria, and this is Palestine also. So you can see a little bit the relationship between all these people. The Druze are somewhere here also. So this is basically how the Armenians come out. And you'll see more about this later on. Let's focus now on the Y DNA haplogroups. Not only, so once you test people all over the world, you come up with a map of where it all started and how humanity basically spread out. You will see a chart later that gives you a sense of time, but all of humanity comes from Africa. And it stayed there for a long, long time. And then you started to have certain waves of migration. There were two waves. First wave came out this way and then went all along the coast and populated Australia. This is the Aborigines. This is the people of Papua New Guinea. This is the Dravidian populations of India. This is the first migration that came out of Africa. There was a second one which went this way and then went either to the west or to the north. I switched slides here. And most of the people in our region in Europe are from this western route, which really developed between 70 and 50,000 years ago. We know that from the DNA record. And this is a very Asian kind of DNA groups that ended up going and populating all of the Americas. This is the Viking who had a small influx before Christopher Columbus found the Americas. This is a back migration also from Indonesia into Madagascar, but really shows you how people basically moved over the year. The DNA proved this. The DNA studies proved it. Going to the next slide, this gives you an idea of the typically African groups came out about 150 or 180,000 years ago. So the ancestor of all of humanity lived in Africa about 180 years ago. And most of us are descendants from that person. And it's only about 70,000 years ago that they started coming out of Africa. And it's 50,000 years ago that you had the second migration and the dissemination. So everything we are, all the different colors, etc., it's all relatively new. It's only 50,000 years old. So, and you get to zero, which is the time now. So you will see this chart again as it applies to Armenians. And then you can split. All of us can get tested, and you will be told that you belong to this or that group. And because your paternal ancestor lived, voila, my maternal grandmother is G, I am J1. G and J1 split 50,000 years ago. So the paternal ancestors of my maternal grandfather and the paternal ancestors of my paternal line, they lived 50,000 years ago is when they had a common ancestor. So this shows you the depth. This shows you how far back in time you can go. If you plot this on a global scale, you see that different regions of the world have different of the groups. You saw them in the previous slide. This shows you the frequency. Most American Indians, North or South American Indians, belong to one group. Most of the people who people this area belong to a few groups. Same thing here. You have the same colors. In Africa now, most of the evolution of the groups that took place was outside of Africa after they left. And in Europe, you have this red color which predominates. And only in our regions, here and in Central Asia, do you have a lot of diversity. The area where you have the most diversity is Central Asia, because it's a mix of Western people and Eastern people. But when you come to Europe and our region, you see that Europeans, West Europeans, are much more only of one group, which is RMB, whereas we Armenians are very mixed. And you will see what that means. When you study the Armenian DNA, you see that male Armenians split basically into 4 groups represent 75%, or 6 groups represent slightly more than that. They're the R1, B1, J2, G, and J1. This is with 1,783 people tested as of now. If you go back to 2013, so 10 years ago, when we only had 547 people, it was exactly the same distribution, you see. We can test millions of Armenians, the distribution is not gonna change. The only thing that changes is that we find sometimes needles in the haystack. Very, very rare DNA that is found very seldom in Armenians, which gives us clues as to some specific origins. But basically, things do not really change. And what's interesting about this is when you plot the DNA of the Armenian paternal lines on the chart that I showed you before, you see that the big one is here. The next big ones are here, J1, J2, and G. And the other ones are here. And you see that their common ancestors lived 50,000 years ago. So very, very long time ago. And it shows that the Armenians are not only mixed as a people, but that the mixing took place a long, long time ago. And as I showed you, it took place when you had all of these population movements and exchanges in the broader region in which we live. When you look at maternal DNA, it's also the same. You have 4 or 5 groups that dominate. It's also the same as the paternal groups. You have a lot of variety in Armenians. So we're really a tutti frutti, a genetic fruit salad, basically, of a lot of different types. But types that existed a long, long time ago. And if you go back to 2012 or 2018, it's basically the same chart, you see. I go like this. It hasn't really changed. And exactly the same thing with the female lines. The biggest groups are in red. The smaller ones are in green. And the common ancestors is 50 or 60,000 years ago. One thing we can do when we study all of these different groups is to determine whether they are autochthonous, which means they came from the region or they came from elsewhere. And the conclusion to which we came when we did that a few years ago is that the majority of them came from exactly where we live. And they've been there for tens of thousands of years. This is important. This is one of the key questions we were asking ourselves. Where do we come from? We seem to be coming from where we're from. But there were a lot of different people who were in this area who were just mixing together at the time. I'm going to show you a little bit some of the groups here. The second biggest group in the Armenians is J2. My wife's paternal line is from there, the Demirjian-Ugrian line. You see, it's very typical of the region. This is the genetic signature of most Lebanese, most Syrians are J2. This is the people who invented agriculture, who founded cities, and they propagated into the rest of the world with their inventions. They're the ones who brought agriculture into Europe and sedentarization. You have a group called G. This is the one that my maternal grandfather belongs to. It predominates in Georgia, but it's only in the Armenian population that you have the most diversity of different types of G. But it shows that it's a very Caucasus, basically Caucasus group. It exists, but in very, very small numbers in the past. J1, the group to which I belong, has an interesting history because the majority of Arabs belong to this group, and Jews. So the Kohen, the Kohanims, they are from a J1 line. Many people in Islam who study the genetics think that the Prophet is from the J1 line also. So it's really something that is associated with nomads at the time, a long time ago. But you have a group of people who belong to an older version of J1, which is found mainly in Dagestan and in other parts of the world. And this is the part that I belong to. And it seems as if my paternal line may have been of Hurrian origin, of Caucasian speakers, because the people who are now closest to me genetically, but you have to go back hundreds of years for that, or more, thousands of years, are the Dargins and the different people who live within Dagestan who speak Caucasian languages. Languages that were probably spoken in Turkey, but that moved to this region afterwards. The most interesting of the 4 biggest groups for Armenians is this one. And you will understand why later, because it's tied to the language that we speak, and it's really fascinating. When we started testing people worldwide, we thought, this is what we saw. 25%, it's the biggest group in Armenians, it's actually 27 right now in our project, in Armenia. 80% in Ireland and all the Gaelic regions of France and Great Britain. 50%, 40%, etc. So when people saw this, they said, aha, so the Armenians are descendants of crusaders. This is the only explanation. Why do you have so many of them here and not as many here? And there were links, we know, at the time of the Crusades, but it really seems to be a lot. When we dig a little bit further and we look at the global map, something strange happens. You still see what I just showed you, but you see a whole group of people in Africa also with this particular genetic signature. And you see them also in, this would be Uzbekistan and Central Asia. When you start digging a little bit deeper, you see that there is a hierarchy, that some of them are old versions and some of them are new versions. And when you do that, you see, in fact, that this particular group came to be in existence more than 10,000 years ago in Anatolia, basically. And then it started branching out. The African branch migrated from this region back to Africa. Some people went there, and all the ones you saw in Africa branched out about 5,000 years ago, let's put it this way, and that's how they went back into Africa. I don't know what pushed them to do that, but they did. And then you had a big period where there was a lot of population movements, and this is where you start seeing it in the Caucasus, in Turkey and in Armenia, the Pontic steppe, and then you have this group, which is the biggest one in the current Armenian population, which you find mainly in us. And all of the other things that you saw are much younger. They came much, much, much later. So when we started seeing this information, when I gave my talk to the Library of Congress, people were saying, aha, could this be tied to the Indo-European language? Could the Armenians have been the ancestors of the people who went into Europe and carried the language with them? The answer would have been yes, had we been higher in the tree, but the answer was no, because we were in a parallel branch. So clearly, the people who populated Western Europe and brought with them that language were from a parallel group. Where did it come from? How did it spread? This is what ancient DNA studies will show us later. And just to show you where the Armenians are again, this is the tree I mentioned. This is the two big groups of Europeans. This is where the Armenians are. You find them at the very, very, very beginning. 4 Armenians in our project, 20 Armenians in a slightly younger version, 464 in here. And of all the Armenians tested, there is only one which is close to a group which is considered a European. You don't have a single Armenian R1b male that is a descendant of a crusader. None, zero. So they lived close to us, we fought together, we fought against each other, they married our women, but none of them, at least yet, have left any male descendants in the Armenian population. So this is something really interesting. And if you look at those two groups that I mentioned, U106 and P312, you can see their current distribution. This is P312, the other one is U106. So you have a Celtic Atlantic branch, you have a Gascony Iberian branch, and you have an Italo-Celtic branch. Then you have a Nordic Germanic branch, but these are all what most of the current West European groups belong to. East European is a different group. So based on what I showed you already, we were arriving at these conclusions when I gave my talk at the Library of Congress. Is there a typical Armenian genetic profiles? Are we, as the mythology says, all descendants of Haik, who came out of the Ark of Noé? Definitely not. We have as much diversity as the animals in the Ark with him also. Extremely diverse. When you split into branches that are let's say, 1,000 years old or more, we belong to 100 different branches of each on the maternal and paternal side. Very, very, very diverse. West Europeans don't have that. Georgians are majority G, but they all belong basically to the same groups. They're not as diverse as we are, so extremely diverse. We seem to be autochthonous, as I mentioned. You remember 80%, 20%, so we really have been there for a very, very, very long time, which makes the genocide and our dispersal a bit sad when you think about it, because we've been spread out and we're getting mixed, so we're losing all of this for some people who have been there for so long. But you see that, you'll see later also that we're still there in a sense. And it shows also, this is something interesting that I haven't touched upon, is that ever since we became Armenians and started speaking the language, we really did not mix with other populations. So we don't find traces in Armenians of people of different descent. So you have only one person who has a very typical Arabic DNA. You only have 2 or 3 people who have Central Asian DNA. So the people who invaded us, the people who went through, the people with whom we were living really did not mix with us. If they did, they maybe stopped being Armenians, or they were not considered as Armenians by the Armenian community. And as a result, we are very, very homogeneous as a population ever since we became Armenians. So much so that people who study populations use us and the Sardinians who live in the uplands of Hardinus as the only people living now who are exactly the same as they were in the Bronze Age. Wow. So for comparisons, it's really, really interesting. It's an interesting thing. And the study of the Armenians is very useful to understanding the migrations of people. And as you will see now, we are very similar genetically to our neighbors. I showed you already one slide on the subject, but the key question we were wondering about at the time was, if we extract DNA from ancient skeletons, will this confirm or infirm what we were thinking we were seeing? Because it was unidimensional, just living people, but we needed to have the three-dimensionality of people who were long dead. So, about the similarities with existing populations. If you plot all of the groups that we belong to, like I showed you before, R1b, you know, the big ones that are most important, R1b, J2, J1, and G, and you plot it for Assyrians, so that includes Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syrian, all the people living with us who were also massacred in the genocides of 1915, you see that the distribution is identical. They are, and when you do a comparison of their genetics, it's exactly the same as ours. When you do maternal DNA, it's exactly the same thing also. They're very similar to us. So we're the same populations, except that they have a different religion, and they speak a different language, a Semitic language, whereas we speak an Indo-European one. If there was a comparison, a study made at the time of, in 2010, when I gave my first speech about Kurdish Jews. So you have to know that when you can split the Jewish community in 3. You have the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, which are the vast majority. But then you have the Mizrahim, who are the Jews who were from the Middle East and who never left. They live in Kurdistan, they live in Iran, they live in Yemen, they lived in Iraq, they lived in Syria, and they lived in very small communities. They lived in Dagestan also even, and Azerbaijan also. And these people, when you test them, they belong to the same haplogroup. So it means that these Jews, before they became Jews, were the same genetically as us before we became Armenians. So very, very similar. And there are other people who are similar to us. I will get to that soon. This is the kind of academic paper I was telling you about, where you study a number of different people. So this one, Balanovsky, is about it's basically living Armenians and some ancient DNA samples. So here again, you come back to what we saw before. Another different way of looking at it, more recent, where they analyze Armenians from different regions of Armenia, from Iran, from Sassoon, Krasnodar in Russia, Gardman, Ararat, and you compare it to other people. So you see the Europeans here, the Caucasus here. They didn't really test any people from the Arab world in here. But you see once again that we're very close to Turks, Azeris, and Iranians and Kurds on the periphery. Georgians are different, and most populations of Caucasus are pretty far away from us. And the further west you go into Europe, the less similar to us they are. Then they came up with, somebody came up with these maps. I'm showing you the one about the Georgians first, because this is comparing Georgians with all the populations next to them. The Georgians speak a different language, Kartvelian language, and they are not that similar. So the darker green it is, the more similar it is. When it gets lighter, it's similar but not similar. Red, it means very different. So you see that the Georgians, there's very few areas of the world where we have people that are very close to them. It's basically Georgia and the Pontic regions of Turkey, and this is Ossetia, North Ossetia. So it's basically the areas where the Georgians are located. But beyond that, there is an affinity, but not as strong as here. Look at the Armenians now. This is the genetic distance of Armenians. So you see that Armenians and the whole population of Western Turkey, which is basically Eastern Turkey, which is basically the area of historical Armenia, is very strongly similar to where we are. And this includes, of course, Azerbaijan. It includes the Azeri portions of Iran also. And it extends a little bit into Georgia, and it extends a little bit into the Farsi population. So this confirms a little bit what I showed you, that we're very close to Turks and Azeris. We're very close also, but less close to Iranians and to Kurds. And the further you go, the less similarity they are. This is Lebanon and Syria. So you see that we're really not that similar genetically to the people living in this area. There are some little clues about history in here also. You see that Crete has strong similarities with the whole region. That's because it has been shown now by extracting ancient DNA from the Minoans that they were people who came from Anatolia and probably spoke an Anatolian language. And the presence in southern Italy is due to the fact that Justinian's armies, when they liberated Italy from the Goths, sent Armenian armies there, and they kind of liked it in Italy. They settled there. And when you do testing of Armenians right now, before the Y chromosome, very strangely, you find the people closest to us are Italians from the south, with whom we have common ancestors 1,500 years ago, more than any other place in Europe. What happens when you look at Turks? When you look at Turks, it's practically identical to the Armenian map, except that it reaches out into Greece, Bulgaria, etc., areas that were conquered by the Ottomans, and you have a lot of people who in these regions became Islamicides and Turkified. Also the north of Libya. So the imprint is much stronger and is tied to the development of the Ottoman Empire. So you see here that we share, so our worst political enemies are in fact our genetic cousins, sadly. Most Azeris and most Turks, especially from the west from the east of Turkey, are really genetically very, very similar to us. And many of them may have been Armenians, but they have been Islamicized and Turkified, and they identify themselves as Turkish, when in fact the genes show that it's a little bit different. So many people from this region who get tested and see that there are genetic similarities are curious about this common and shared past. How far back does it go? We don't really know. This is the Lebanese map, since we're in Lebanon and many of you are not Armenians, so this is for your benefit. You see that there is affinity basically to the region where we are here, Iraq. I think history says that some of the tribes that came here were some Christian tribes that moved. Gassarites. Voilà. This maybe is proof of that, and this also area may be the area where you have Coptic Christians also that are ancient Egyptians. Maybe there's a link also to us. Whereas this is Cairo and all of the delta of the Nile. So, and of course Cyprus, very close, and the southern coast of Lebanon. But as you get into the areas where Armenia and Caucasus is, there's less influence. So the Armenians, the Lebanese are genetically close to these kinds of populations. Now, when you look at the Central Asian component, since we were talking about the Turks and the Azeris, Turks and Azeris have 10 to 12% of Central Asian blood. When you ask them what's their origin, they will tell you 99% they come from here. They're not from here. But their genes say something different. In fact, they have more ancestry from Eastern Europe than they do from Central Asia. This is what comes out. But Armenia, of course, as I said, has no Central Asian genes. And the Russians have much more blood from Central Asia from various invasions than Armenians do. This brings us now to the next lines of research. The most interesting and exciting part, this is the updated part, ancient DNA. You can now extract DNA from ancient skeletons. Of course, the way they were, if they were cremated, it's complicated. If they were buried, it depends in which conditions. If it's dry, it's easier. If it's cold, it's easier. But even so, they can extract DNA from teeth. And then a favored area also is the small bone that's in the ear also. If they can find that, they can extract DNA from that. The older it gets, the more degraded it is. But they can really do wonders also with this. They have machines that then process this. You have to avoid contamination. This is the kind of machine that you use basically to, it's called whole genome sequencing machines. They're pretty affordable. I purchased a number of them and gifted them to Levon Episkoposion so he could do some research on Armenians. But it's being done on a massive scale right now. But you have to have proper digs where you have geneticists also who are with the archaeologists and they follow the proper procedures also. The dating by the archaeologists and then the dating by the whole genome sequencing. To basically take the teeth, grind them into a powder, treat them with various chemicals, then isolate DNA from it, and then multiply this DNA, and then you can compare it to the DNA of other ancient populations and living populations. So by extracting ancient DNA, you can find out if the Y DNA and mtDNA, the male and female lines that exist now, existed in the past also. This is one thing you can do. And you can make inferences about past populations and about population movements. And what we're finding now, the more people we test, is that we're finding what we call ghost populations. So people who lived at a period of time and were very important at that time, but are lost in the historical record. But they lived in a certain area, they moved and conquered other areas, they migrated or they were chased by other people. And these people left a genetic imprint on various living people, but you don't find direct records of them. You'd find, for the time being, their trace in various populations, and that's why we call them ghost populations. I should mention something very interesting also here, is that, remember the chart that I showed you at the beginning with the humanity going out of Africa? When we moved out of Africa in two waves, the rest of the world was populated by hominins, so people like us, but who separated from our ancestors 700,000 to 1 million years ago. The most well-known are the Neanderthals. They were living as early as 50,000 years ago. They were still Neanderthals living in Europe. You have people who lived in Siberia called the Denisovans. They separated from the human ancestors 700,000 years ago. They were still living in Siberia 50,000 years ago. And they found also a small population of very tiny people called the Homo florensis on an island in Indonesia, also who separated a long time ago. And what's really fascinating, by extracting the ancient DNA, they found that one of the skeletons of the Denisovans from Siberia, the person whose DNA they analyzed was like, his mother was a Neanderthal and the father was a Denisovan, and they mixed. And the other interesting thing is that the traces of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans are in our blood. We all have ancestry, particularly of Neanderthals, us. We have a few percentages. Africans don't have, because Neanderthals were not living in Africa. And people in Asia have a mix of Neanderthal and Denisovan. And the parts of the DNA of these people that we have are things that gave us protections against certain diseases, or other reasons why, for evolutionary reasons, they were useful to us. That's why they still remain in us. But we have not yet found a single person, male or female, who is a direct descendant of a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. So this is something interesting that ancient DNA gives us, going back a long, long time in the world. So this is a paper by Alan Toft that sampled, we're talking here 2015. This is only 1 year after my talk at the Library of Congress. We're talking about 101 ancient DNA samples. Then you have this paper by Ashot Margarian and also Morten Allentoft that basically looked at 52 ancient DNA samples and compared them to 200 living Armenians. And where did they get this ancient DNA? This, Nadine, you will find that interesting. This is basically all the various periods, the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Kura-Araxes, the Middle Bronze Age cultures, La Chaîne Metsamor, Urartu, the closest, classical medieval, this is medieval times, historical times, and modern. This is the number of samples they have, 3, 1, 6, 5, 29, 4, and 26, and 206, and this is how far it goes. This is now, and this is 8,000 years before Christ, so you're talking about 10,000 years of DNA that was extracted from these regions. They're all basically here in historical Armenia, okay? What conclusion do they come to? So they were able at the beginning to extract just the mitochondrial DNA, the female DNA that I showed you before, of these 52 ancient populations, and they compared it to living Armenians. And the conclusion, basically, genetic continuity in the maternal gene pool. So this is what I told you before. We have proof now that the maternal lines of Armenians living now are the same as those who lived hundreds, thousands, and almost tens of thousands years ago. And I'm going to cycle through very quickly. Okay, this basically shows you where they were found, what period it was, Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, and it shows you the groups to which they belong. You remember the numbers that I showed you before. We even have Urartian DNA also, mitochondrial DNA. And when you compare these people to people who have been tested either by family tree DNA or by Margarian himself, because he took samples from living Armenians, you see that you have one ancient DNA sample that comes from 2,200 years ago, basically, that is with living Armenians who are in the same group. This is H6B1. This is another one. You see, this is 1,000-year-old. Look at the number of Armenians who belong to this group currently, and look at this ancient form. This is yet another group. I'm proud to say that my wife here, her maternal line, she's all from Aintab. She's part of HA81. She's one of these people right here, and it means that she had a direct maternal ancestor or a cousin of her direct maternal ancestor that lived 2,400 years ago in Armenia. So it's the case, huh? Yeah. On the paternal side, we didn't do the same thing, but this is the maternal side. So here again, time and time again. The other thing that's interesting in this is that you see what are the other nationalities of the people. You have a Druze here, you have an Italian here. Here you have Iranian. You have more Iranians right here. This is a very European group, and there's Armenians in there, living in ancient. This is people who live in Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan, also very old lines. This is a very European group. This one is full of Iranians, some Germans, Jordanians, a Lebanese, and 3 ancient Armenians, and a number of living Armenians. So over and over and over, I'm not going to bore you with this. You see that on the maternal lines, at least, the old inhabitants are the same genetically as the current inhabitants. Then you had a paper that was quite interesting by Mark Haber, who's a Lebanese, who works in Denmark also, with a very famous place in Denmark that does this with Chris Tyler Smith. And he also has Pierre-Jacques Zaloua, whom many of you know because he studied the DNA of Lebanese and ties to the Phoenicians. So they prepared this interesting papers on the Armenians only. And they tested 178 living Armenians. So what's interesting about this slide from their paper is that it puts you again in this 2000 current period and 5,000 years ago. And it shows that during the period where Armenians came into existence, you had a lot of movements of populations here. This is a very, very, very busy period. Where you had a lot of exchanges between different regions in the southern arc, Caucasus, North Levant, Caucasus, South Levant. You had a lot of movement between these cultures, and this is during these formative times that the Armenians came into existence, and you had all this diversity that I showed. Afterwards, once they became what they were, they stayed put until now. With very little mix from any other people. So these are some of the conclusions from Mark and Pierre's paper. We're a distinctive cluster linking the Near East and Europe. Our diversity can be explained by mixtures of Eurasian populations that happened 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. This is why we belong to so many different groups. Major population migrations after the domestication of the horse, appearance of chariots, and rise of advanced civilizations in the Near East. But they see that at 1,200 before Christ, the mixing stopped, and we became frozen as a population, basically. And Armenians have since remained genetically isolated. The next slides deal with the Indo-European language. There were many theories about, two competing theories about where Indo-European languages started from. One theory, and they were really fighting like cats and dogs in time. One thought that it was here, right where historical Armenia is, and it propagated this way. Because you should know that the Iranian languages and many languages in India are part of the Indo-Aryan group that they call, and the rest all went this way. There was another theory that these languages developed in the steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and they evolved like this. And as I said, Herodotus said that the Armenians came this way, and they were cousins of the Phrygians, and the genetic record shows that this is not true, because there is not a single Armenian who has East European ancestry. So I don't know how it entered the historical record, but genetically it is not the case. So just so you know what the families, they think, people who delve into languages think that the Anatolian languages also were a long time ago close to the Indo-European ones, but we don't have any living Anatolian languages left, so it's just suppositions. But you see that these are the main centers of populations. This is the Indo-Iranian languages. There was a small group that was living in the deserts of China, the Tokharians. Then you have the big groups being the Balto-Slavic languages, the Germanic, the Italic. French is part of the Italic. English is part of the Germanic languages. And then the Celtic languages. And of course, here you have three groups that are a little bit different than the others: Armenians, Greeks, and Albanians. These are three Indo-European languages that are not very close to the others, but they have common roots. So, in a very important book, if you want to know everything about DNA, I suggest you buy it. It's Who We Are and How We Got There by David Reich. It came out in 2018. It's a little bit dated, but it's very, very interesting. It explains everything I did in a lot of detail and looks at populations everywhere. American Indians, the tribes of the oceanic tribes. It looks at all the populations, African populations, the big kingdoms in Asia. And it explains how DNA helps solve ancient riddles. But one of the things he says here is that the most likely location of the population that first spoke an Indo-European language was south of the Caucasus Mountains, perhaps in present-day Iran or Armenia, because ancient DNA from people who lived there matches what we would expect from a source population for this culture, and I will show you how important that is, an ancient Anatolian. So he says that we're still missing a DNA from some of the people who lived there. If Hittites spoke an extinct Indo-European language, if we can get DNA from the Hittites, we might find out where they came from, although language is not the same as genes. You can change languages, as I said, but it would be something curious to have. Remember that what I showed you before, that one of the theories was that the languages started here, and there's a culture called Yamnaya, who would have been at the origin of this theory, and the other competing theory is that it originated here. This is the most important paper that came out. It's a trio of paper by all these people, okay? All these people collaborating together. They tested 727 ancient DNA samples, and it came out in August 2022. And there were a lot of press articles. It's basically David Reich, the guy who wrote the book, who heads this team, and they came under the name of a Greek geneticist. In this group, you have a lot of archaeologists, historians, and people, anthropologists. And I recently had, in June of this year, a panel discussion organized by ARPA, an organization in California, where three of the Armenian historians, archaeologists who belong to this group commented these articles, and I was the moderator. It's available on the website of ARPA if you're interested. But the way they explain things, the others, it's a more complicated to understand because it's a complicated subject. But it's worth watching and it's worth reading these papers. So this is the second one. The first one is called The Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia Suggests Distinct Pre-Pottery and Pottery Neolithic Migrations. This is the oldest part. Then this is the southern arc, the part that interests us. And then this is basically the last slide or the next to last slide in the whole presentation. And it's the most important one. Based on their findings, so first of all, we're going to look at what we have on the side here, okay? All of the populations currently living here originated a long time ago from some populations that no longer exist. You had hunter-gatherers. Before the invention of agriculture, our ancestors were basically hunting animals and gathering fruits and seeds. There were no seeds, they were gathering fruits. So they would gather their food or hunt for the food that they would eat. And in this region, you had some Eastern hunter-gatherers. You had some Caucasus hunter-gatherers who lived in the Caucasus region. You had some Balkan hunter-gatherers, so you had different populations of hunter-gatherers. Then you had the Levantine population and an Anatolian Neolithic population These people were they're the people who created all of the first cities. It's all the archaeological sites that I showed you, and it extended down to the Levant. So they were starting to develop all sorts of things that enabled the propagation of a lot of things like metallurgy, domestication of animals, etc., whereas the other people were basically hunter-gatherers living the old way of life. And you can find now these populations in the genes of Armenians, people from Anatolia, from Greece to the Balkans, and this Yamnaya culture, because we were able to extract their ancient DNA. And what we see here is that 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, basically, you had a group of people who left this area and moved up here. And we think, they think now that the Indo-European languages were indeed born in the Caucasus region, and that these people took the language over there. From there, it spread all over the world, and there was a back migration 5,000 years ago of some of these populations into Armenia, which brought back the Indo-European language in a more evolved form in our region. And the signature, the genetic signature of those people has been established to be R1b, which is 25 to 30% of the population in Armenia. And by analyzing the DNA of Armenians and comparing it to those of Anatolians, we see that we have a small trace left of steppe ancestry. So we are the only ones of the populations in this region, and of course the Turks and the Azeris who became Turkish and Azeri, but have the same background, we're the only ones who went there and came back and brought with us the language. This is what genetics has shown in this very, very big study. It also showed that Anatolia has been completely impervious to any kind of steppe influence. So it never entered the heart of Anatolia, but it subsists only in Armenian populations. And of course, here you have the Anatolian Neolithic. These are the people who went this way with the invention of agriculture. It's the majority in Greece and the Balkans in these periods, of course, not currently. And they have a little bit of Caucasian hunter-gatherer. These have more steppe than this. And of course, these have some Balkan. So you always have mixes of populations. So this is basically shows that both theories about the Indo-European language are true. It originated here, it spread from here, and our language came back to us from there because we find a trace of their genes in our genes, and you don't find it in other speakers. So one of the people who was part of that study, Arsène Bobokian, was part of the panel discussion. So this very important things that he mentioned, I think this is the last slide of the lot. So basically going back in the past, Neolithic Anatolians were descended from local hunter-gatherers and populations from the southern arc, basically. Early forms of Anatolian and non-Indo-European languages, such as Hattic and Hurrian, who were probably Caucasian languages, were spoken by migrants who were mixing in this big mixture that I was talking to you about. And as I mentioned, in Anatolia, you don't have any steppe hunter-gatherers. It's been established that the Yamnaya culture initiated a chain of migrations linking Europe in the west all the way to China and India in the east. What these people were, basically, they're the guys who invented the chariots and had horses. So they moved fast, and that's how they spread all over the world. They were probably warriors also. So they conquered many of the populations they went to. And in Europe, they completely replaced the existing populations. So these people are the ones who introduced the Indo-European languages. And some of them moved into the Balkans, mixed with the locals, and that's where Greek, Paleo-Balkan, so all the Eastern European languages, Slavic languages, and the Albanian languages arose. All ancient and present-day branches of the language family can be linked to Yamnaya, including Armenian. because, and what was interesting is that the Yamnaya were not a population only from the steppe. Half of them came from the Caucasus initially, half were from up there. And it's this back migration which gives 12 to 13% of steppe ancestry in existing Armenians. It was a return to the homeland, the linguistic homeland, if you want, and the genetic homeland. The Yamnaya expansion having crossed in the Caucasus, by 4,000 years ago, Armenia had become an enclave of low but pervasive steppe ancestry, as I mentioned, where the patrilineal descendants of Yamnaya men, who are extinct on the steppe, by the way. These people who spread out don't exist there anymore. They have been completely replaced by other populations. Now, this is where the Armenian language was born when these people returned. So this is really, really the beauty of ancient DNA studies when it's done on a large scale with a collaborative effort by so many different people. You come to discover things that you wouldn't believe you have believed, because you could do as much research in history and archaeology, but this is archaeogenetics. Some of it is still inference, but the more they test, the more they verify, the more they are able to reconstruct all of this information. Voila, the conclusion is, of course, ancient DNA sheds a lot of light. I just mentioned all of these things. There's no need to repeat it. And ever since we became Armenians, we've been very, very stable. Voila. With this, I end my talk. Just mention that the Armenian DNA project is still out there. It has a Google page and a Facebook page. There's a lot of information you can look at. And I have a separate little project, pet project, that I mentioned here, which has nothing to do with genetics. And it's more interested in the life of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire before the genocide. Basically, many of us cry about our lost cities and towns, but do we really know what they look like? Do we really know what people dress like? Do we know what food they ate, what songs they sang, what games they played? Not really. So, and a lot of the Armenians who left during the genocide, when they realized that they would never return, started writing books of memories. That's what Hushamadian means. And these books were written not by historians, so they were more recollections. And we have a group of historians in Berlin now who are working on this, and they're trying to recreate the life of every single village and town or region in which Armenian lives in the Ottoman Empire. And the work they do is absolutely amazing. One of the things they do, which is very touching, is that many Armenian families just grabbed one thing when they left, which was very precious to them, and took it with them. And it still remains in the families to this day. And so they collect these things and they exhibit them sometimes. And by telling the story of the object, they will tell you why that object was so important. A piece of tapestry, a tool or book, and it will retrace also the path that these people lived when they fled. And what's most interesting also is that many of the people who log on to the Facebook page and participate in the discussion, the website is in 3 languages. It's in Armenian, in English, and in Turkish. And many of the people who join and are part of this are Kurds or Turks or other populations from the area who long to see what the diversity that they lost because of the genocide, and who actually help people try to locate homes, etc. So it's creating a sense of community of what it was before. Since it's never going to be recreated, at least people know what it's like. So it's a very interesting project. Voilà. And with this, thank you.